record. All right. So I think we are ready to roll. Hi everyone and welcome, and thank you for being here today. I am Alessandra Saviotti. I am a curator and educator, and I'm currently a PhD researcher at the Liverpool John Moores University School of Art and Design. This is actually the first panel discussion as part of the DPE Roaming Symposium, because we decided to start with, let's say, a more quote-unquote practical approach. So we started already with a couple of workshops, which saw Daniel the first day, and this morning Gemma Medina together with me. So I'm actually delighted to have these amazing panelists today. Artist Daniel Godínez-Nivón, who is connecting from Mexico City, researcher, curator and educator Gabriela Saenger Silva, who is in Liverpool, and curator of education at Museum Boijmans van Beuningen, Lisa Heinis, who is joining from Rotterdam. And then, of course, I would also like to welcome my colleagues, John Byrne, who is the director of the City Lab at Liverpool John Moores University, and Poppy Bowers, who is curator of exhibition at the Whitworth. Before starting, I just like to really quickly mention some house rules, even though I think by now everybody's familiar with the Zoom environment. So at the bottom left of your screen, you have the microphone that you can mute and unmute in case you would like to ask a question or to speak. Also the video, the same, just be free to activate or deactivate the camera whenever you want. And then at the middle of the screen, you have the chat and also some reactions that you can, just click in case you'd like to send us some not verbal or not written feedback. So I'm also inviting John to perhaps say something a little bit about the symposium before we proceed with the panel.
Yeah, I've said this a couple of times in our more practical lead-in sessions. It's great to have you all here, and it's great to be having a discussion which we hope will really seriously form part of a process of us thinking and rethinking our relationships to usership, to decentralization, and how we can rethink and use art as a form of direct activism, and how we can think of reframing art and museums in a way that's sensitive to both the best of what we have and can begin to open us up to the best of what we can do, really. So, as you all know, these talks will form part of the Toolkit's side of the Decentralizing Political Economies website that Alessandra's building, and will lead to a series of questions that we'll then take forward to begin asking as we run up to a show at the Whitworth called Economics the Blockbuster, which is currently slated for 2023. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So I think in this panel discussion, we are going to mainly talk about toolkits, institutions of education, museums and schools, but I hope that mainly we can focus on the process behind the imagination, the production and the application and dispersion of new sort of method and methodologies conceived as tools, which are somehow the result of the intersection between art and education. So when I was preparing the intro for this panel, I was actually wondering, and I was asking myself, what happens when the art project, as we know it, becomes the center for conceiving inclusive education programs within the museum, the biennial, and the curriculum in the case of our guests and our panelists. So, and I was also asking, what does it mean when the role of the artist and the curator meets with that of the educator? So this is, let's say, the main focus of this panel. And what does this have to do with the idea of decentralizing political economy? And I was also asking myself. So this week, as I was saying earlier, together with some of you who joined the previous sessions, we looked at using dreams, for example, as a knowledge tool. Or this morning we went through the coefficient of art through different like angle. And I guess this panel comes at the right time, at the right moment, because we can actually exchange how these kinds of tools are applied in very different contexts. It uses this kind of common ground, which is the intersection between art and education and the curatorial process. So in particular, I think we looked at already what happens when, rather than focusing on the concept of art in and of itself, we rather focus on the idea of what art can do. And this is something that is coming up a lot in the previous workshop, but also in all the conversations that we have been having with John and Poppy around decentralizing political economy. So what does it mean to use the context of the art in order to actually decentralize political economies, right? So so we were also thinking about the idea of, let's say, subtract art from scarcity somehow, because if we are thinking to produce toolkits and to look at embodied practices as tools, it means that we basically we are not focusing only on an object anymore, but perhaps on a shared method, or exactly like I said, an embodied practice that can be actually used as a tool by a lot of people, etc., etc. So how the relation with, for example, the economy in a broader sense changes when we are enacting this kind of process and we are talking about this kind of projects and practices. So the idea of this panel is precisely to look at what tools we have been developing as a way to consider the project, the art project, at the center of the discussion, as a device that goes beyond an object, or perhaps that becomes a manual or a toolkit in and of itself. So hopefully you had already some time to go through the presentations of our guests, and if not, you can watch it maybe also later at the link dpe.tools. And I'm just gonna quickly perhaps share with you the screen in case you are not familiar with the website yet, because I think somehow it needs a little bit of we need to go through a little bit, so you see how the symposium is organized, and it's going to be sort of documented and used as a toolkit in itself. So, for example, if you go to the session of today, you already have the link to the presentations. So we are not going to look at the presentations now, but because we are really also try to question and try to understand how to use, for example, the format of the symposium differently, right? So we would like to have the possibility to use this moment of the panel also to engage more in a discussion and a conversation. So I'll stop here. I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and perhaps try to sum up, like in a couple of minutes, what you have been discussing and the presentation. And in particular, I would like to ask you to, think about or say something about how you perceive your relationship with education in your practice. So whoever would like to start, please unmute yourself and yeah, the floor is yours.
It's gonna be me. It's always me.
Very good.
It's always Gabriela. So my name is Gabriela, and I am. For me, it's really, really important how I came in touch with education somehow in my process. I think it's a really kind of changing point. This proximity to education. I was always in my life. I was in a executive producer of big events, like doing big things. I had like sometimes thousands of people under my projects and things like that. And in a certain point, I went to corporate things, you know, like hated it, of course. And then in the middle of the thing, someone offered me to work for biennial, the Mercosul biennial in south of Brazil, in Porto Alegre. It was something I have done before as a mediator, like in the early years of my university. But there was like this project of a residency in the middle of the three borders in between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, working with 4 artists and also like embedded in the community from the motor riders that crosses the bridge in between Paraguay and Brazil, and working with the Mbua Guarani and living in the village with them for 2 weeks. So I had like 4 different completely projects to produce and work for. And in the middle of that, somehow I got in touch with the education team of the biennial that started to invite me because I was fluent in English and I could translate the talks with artists coming around. And I started to understand that there was like kind of a whole different kind of process that was going on at the time in the biennial there. And that's because our education curator was Luis Kamnitzer, Uruguayan artist. And at the time he was introducing to the Mercosul biennial with the partnership Gabriel Pérez Barreiro, this completely kind of completely kind of different shape of the project in which we all like working together, suggesting and working the process that we could input ourselves in that. So Gabriel was a guy that was, at the same time he was there, he was in the evening with the directors, and later on he was in my living room having a beer on the floor. So I'm telling this because it's completely like different. The relations was different. So somehow from the absolutely beginning, I was spoiled into this kind of dreamy place in which we could input everything. And then from that, I was invited to come back and be part of the education pedagogical team of the biennial. I'm just telling all this because somehow the understanding from Monica Hoff, that was the coordinator, was that she was taking me off from the elite team of producers and pushing me to the education team, which wasn't so harsh and fashionable and things like that, because I was going to work on the ground in a different position. So somehow through time, this is somehow, I'm trying to understand this dissemination about this. So because I think it speaks directly to what you're talking about, the economy and the roles. So from the beginning, I was like, I'm a spoiled producer here, working with these amazing people, learning from them how to be an educator, which is like a gift, you know. I learned from Luis Kamnitzer how to educate on the ground. This is like a really amazing process. But at the same time, I had to understand hardly after this experience that was a really kind of a dreamy position that we wouldn't maybe repeat again for a really long time, and maybe never, because the position of education in the projects and the rules is not always the one that takes consideration and the front, because those like if we have to cut somewhere, we're going to cut the money to hire mediators. What happened in Liverpool biennial 2018? You know what I mean? Like, this is the situations, because if you don't have money enough, maybe you have 20,000, but we're going to put this in some new sculpture commission, not into develop personnel here. Anyway, so 2007, 2007 was the 6th Mercosul biennial. This is how I started my career in arts, and now I'm a PhD student researching about discursive programs of biennials, trying to reflect what happened this last 15 years and 14 years actually, and these 10 editions of biennials I did in between Mercosul, São Paulo, and Liverpool biennial. But I want to say that for me, one of the most important things that happens is this change, this necessary change of the relations of the roles, because they directly reflect on the relations of the economy and how we think and we propose our budget in art somehow. Because on the process, we kind of extracted from the artist as a creative process, the creative process, because maybe it's kind of rather difficult, but also in inserting a community, you have to understand that loads of the creative process of the artist that's coming later on is because people are available to create this collective narrative with him or her or they somehow. I hope this is a good introduction so far, and let's go.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Lisa?
Sure. It's always difficult with digital things to feel who's going to go next. But hi, I'm Lisa Heinis. I'm a curator of education at Museum Boijmans in Beuningen in Rotterdam. I have been working as an art mediator since 2012. I started at Manifesta biennial when it was in Belgium. Also felt very lucky. Was curated by Medina from Mexico City. And it was also like in a very, very small village in Belgium. And I remember like living in a house with some art mediators, production team, and Cuauhtemoc was there like brushing his teeth. And just like, okay, I don't think this usually happens. So it was also a really nice collaboration between everybody. There wasn't a fancy restaurant to go to in that place. But then I studied art history. I moved to San Francisco where I wrote a PhD and also worked as a research team at the Waters Institute. So I've always had like one foot in research and education and one foot in my PGs and really theoretical stuff. So when I got the job as a curator of education, it really felt like, okay, this is a really nice balance between the two. But it's also a very strange function because the job doesn't really exist in a lot of places, doesn't some, but it's really not defined to what a curator of education does. So at Boijmans, almost every museum, as a curator, you usually have your field of knowledge, modern art, like just drawings. I don't have that. Education is my speciality. So I'm also a part of the education team more than I am a part of the curatorial team. But at this point, our buildings are closed. So the museum is closed for renovation and we are set to open our collection building, which will be fully accessible to the public in about 2 weeks. So we don't really have a place for the past 2 years to show art. And that's when I started about 1.5 years ago. So I'm now involved in a project we call the Rss Educator, something a term that Alessandra also knows very well. Because we were really very self-reflexively thinking at the museum about our jobs because we didn't have a place for exhibition. So usually as an education program, you respond to the exhibitions that you have or the permanent collection, and we didn't have art. We also have a location in Rotterdam South, which is a more difficult place in the city. And there's no art there, but there's a lot of projects, there's residencies, there's fellowships. And we were also really thinking of how do you work with artists as an education department, which we usually do. A lot of the art mediators are artists, and really think a little bit more abstractly about our collection than a very literal workshop for children or something like that. So it's one of the really fun projects that I've been working on besides opening that building in a few weeks.
Thanks, Lisa. Daniel, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriela and Lisa. Well, my relationship with education started in around 2008 after doing, just finishing my school, my art school. My work and my research during school was reflecting of my own indigenous heritage, my own family, the lack of narrative about my own family and history. Because both my grandfather, mother and father from Oaxaca, from Juchitán, they didn't taught the language to their kids, and just a few stories, just a few beautiful dresses, traditional dresses, and some sporadic visits to the hometown. But as I grew up as a child, I had these stories that created just really prolific, imagination in my childhood. But it was a huge mystery, because I started to see in school, since I was a kid, other ways to conceive, the hegemonical way to conceive, reality, and these other stories, basically stories about, ghosts and terror, that kind of thing. Both my grandfather and mother like to do that kind of thing with their grandchildren. But after finishing this process of trying to create this new iconography of my family, all the women in my family, I came from the only matriarchal society in Mexico, it's Juchitán, Oaxaca. So I come from a family of very strong and powerful women, and all the images I created as a student were my mother, my grandmother, and all my aunts. After finishing this process, I began to work with them to reflect on how this huge diversity that exists in my country is represented. How it is represented in school. I never knew in school about this huge diversity. And even though in the streets in Mexico City, you can see these people dressed in their own, traditional indumentary, but they are like some sort of ghosts. They like a bad, they don't really have a presence in the city. So I started to work with the AMI, the Assembly of Indigenous Migrants, la Asamblea de Migrantes Indígenas, in order to find a way to reflect on how people can be represented, what other efforts of these groups, migrant groups, specifically from Oaxaca, like the one from my family, what are the efforts trying to create visibility in the city? There, I began to know about Tequio, as you saw in the video. I spoke about Tequio also in the workshop, and the power of the assembly. And this is really important because it's a way that I start to reflect about education. Because of this, then I found myself with the urgency of working with others in a more academical way. Also, I became a teacher in the university, but only before I only working with the AMI and these assembly processes, because there is a moment where you can actually listen to each other. You start to reflect on the power of enunciating things, but also something that's really important, the power of creating their own narratives. In this assembly, I start to realize the huge diversity, even between different Zapotecas, Mijes, Mixtecs, and Triquis, different ways. I was really amazed of how they start to draw attention about different ways to conceive reality, even death, for instance, the way people approach death. That was one of the first subjects, life and death. And that became to be not only thank you in the creation of a specific work, but the power of that has creating our own narratives. And as an artist, I start to conceive this as a way to to conceive education, because in these assemblies, as a teacher, I conceive in the same way pretty much, because also art and education try to conceive to expand the notion of reality, unfold perception, and participate in the creation of knowledge. And that for me is really important, and I feel really, calmed also ethically working in this assembly process, because the important thing is to create, I'm not using drawing, for instance, my techniques as an artist, but how can I create an image that can represent this diversity? Then we can get more and more in the discussion, but how the stories make sense for them, and how limited is our education here in Mexico City, at least the educational system. So I began to work with those notions, and as an artist, try to be some sort of medium to incorporate these social tools in the school context. But that's how I began to work in school, because of the AMI, because of these specific and really antique techniques, and the power of narratives and storytelling.
Well, thank you very much for this first round of, not just presentation, but also of sharing like the different experiences that you all have towards education. I think it's very interesting to hear also how different like contexts such as of the museum, the biennial, or like in the practice of Daniel, who is working as artist, but also as educator, have, like different layers and different interpretations. So I'm just gonna go back to Lisa because I noticed that during your presentation you spoke and also when you presented, when you just spoke here, you mentioned the fact that of course the depot it's like a building that has to preserve artworks for the eternity, right? So you mentioned this word that somehow it's quite, it resonated a lot for me, right? So of course, I think this is something that it's also related to all of us considering our practices in different ways, which goes somehow beyond the object. So I'm going back to this idea of the embodiment of a practice. But also I think it's connected to the idea of space. So perhaps we won't need a space such as we know it because education becomes an embodied tool that we could use, also in the context of the museum, for example. So is it something that you have been exploring in the Artist as Educator project? And you also mentioned something perhaps related to the fact that in a different neighbor of the city, there is a space where you don't have the heart. So, yeah.
Yeah, and like with the Eternity, with opening, so the new collection building at DPE Boijmans on Beuningen is right next to the museum. And it's a very big, you should Google it, it's a huge building with all glass, it's very flashy. And it's just a storage facility, but it will be publicly accessible. It's like a library, but most doors are closed because we have to preserve these objects. And there's really this tension between the collection side, whose one focus in life is just to preserve this collection, all these objects, and then on the other side, there's people who are like more on the museum side who want to show the art as much as possible. And there's really both sides that kind of function in this one building together. And there's always, I like this, there's this magic that happens usually when an artwork like is acquired. If it's a local artist, it will arrive in like the back of somebody's car, or they just have it in a bag and they arrive. And in the second that we accept it, it's like white gloves, and there's just transformation to like art. And it's really a magical moment, and they don't question objects. Their only job, if I say that this is an artwork, they will be fine. It's plastic, we'll preserve it there in these conditions. That's really the function of this building, which I think is a very interesting thing. So for the Eternity, I think it's difficult, but time definitely is important for what we're doing with our with the education program, because I don't, like you are with the DPE, and you're like, how do we capture these processes without really having to have these objects at the end of it? So if I'm working with an Rss Educator, I really want to focus on how they're working, and I don't want to have the requirement at the end that they have to have a photograph or something tangible. But like the process of working for me is a lot more. It has to be able to go where it has to go. Otherwise, you're already setting limitations to like a process of collaborating that hasn't happened yet. But that's not easy. So I think at the end of this, we have 3 artists that we're working with: Sikun Chong, Priscilla Fernandez, and Creative Studio, a collective of 2 people. And at the end, I'm trying to write I am writing a small little publication about what they did, why they did it, what would they do differently at the end of it. And also, like, how was the collaboration between the museum and them? Because we also set some limitation, budget, time, all that stuff that we have to account for. And if I want to do this again, I really want to make sure that I learn from what they did, because otherwise it kind of loses it. It loses all the stuff that, like, we do it again and we start from zero. I don't really want to do that. So how do you build knowledge within such a program, but also leave a lot of room and space to kind of go wherever it needs to be able to go? I think also for like the eternity, these objects don't immediately come into the collection after we've done them, because they are strictly education programs. So they could become a workshop that we keep doing or something. That is definitely possible, but they're not collection pieces. And the tension between, is it an artwork or is it an education program? It is, you can see with the artists, sometimes it's like difficult for them to mediate between the two. And I think that's actually wonderful, because that's kind of the entire purpose of it, is that it's not really clear in the end what it is. But that also makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of, so there's a lot of conversations happening during and me reassuring artists that it's fine. This is a process. Let's just figure it out and do our best. So there's definitely a time within a process without a focus on like objects. But as with after you do that, like that sometimes an idea can also, we have artworks that we don't have in our collection that we have in our collection. Like there's a pindakaas floor, like the peanut butter floor. It's not like we have jars of peanut butter. So it's not a new thing that ideas can also be contained in the collection.
Thanks, Lisa. It's definitely super interesting, because also on DPE, for example, we have been also exploring how museums, collections are approaching this kind of projects, for example. And somehow you really have to change. But first of all, you have to change the language to describe this kind of practices. And that's one very important, like aspect and step, because like we cannot use the same words that we use to describe like a sculpture or a painting or a photograph to describe like a project, for example, that Daniel presented in his presentation, like techiographias. So it, like how can you apply the same language to something that doesn't fit with that language? So there is a conversation that we recorded with the two head of collections at the Vadambe Museum and at the Whitworth about the acquiring of the Arte Utile archive, which is precisely what you mentioned. Like there are some common aspects also in that. So I'd like to go back to Daniel, because we have been discussing this idea of the object and a different kind of practice, which is not related to having like a final production or like a sort of formalization of the process into an object. And I think, I guess for you, Daniel, it's a little bit the same, or like this tension, no, between the process, the object, but the experience and the embodiment of experience is quite central in your practice. So I was wondering, or like, I'm curious to hear from you, how do you resolve this aspect? And what are your tools that you have been using in working with so many different communities, such as community of students, the AMI, the Assembly of Indigenous Migrants in Mexico City, or the midwives, or like the teenagers? So I'm curious to hear what are your tools, or how do you resolve this tension in your work?
Yes, Alessandra, thank you. Thinking about, as Lisa already mentioned, this problem with eternity and preservation and the power of ideas. That's something that is, for instance, working with dreams, with Eugenia, my mentor and dreamer teacher. That knowledge is something that has passed through generations for many, many years now, and has a specific how do you say, congruency or cohesion in a specific context. Me as an artist, what I do is working in those specific groups and communities. I realize that the school, the official one, don't pay any attention about this sensibility. Not only about dreams, for instance, but different ways of perceiving reality. In some projects, for instance, the one that I do with Amauta Garcia, that I also mentioned in the presentation, CASA, working in elementary schools in rural communities. What we do is to incorporate those sensibilities of the perception of nature or even with dreams in the school context. So the mothers basically are the more participant always in those communities, and well, I mean every time, and they are the mentors in the school, the new teachers, and they start to speak about the way they heal using plants, how to turn the baby around when it is upside down, and those knowledges begin to be important, even though it's really specific, but and it is an elementary school. But what we use is to use that space as a space of legitimacy to try to conceive other notions. But basically, my tools, not only TechU, which is, of course, can be a little bit complex. And in order to understand, you need to experience it. No, because you can reflect on it, but you need to be part of the TechU. But it's the power of narrative, because narrative is a way of to conceive identity. For instance, our workshop, the amazing workshop we had, so prolific, it was because just based in our exercise of dreaming together and the ability to listen to each other, began to work to create a whole specific narrative that can detonate processes in the future. And that's basically the problem with the objects as well, because it's really different. It's really difficult to many objects. It's really difficult to represent ourselves in objects, to represent this huge diversity. That's why also a toolkit, for instance, can be a little bit more generous, how to synthesize these notions and ideas that we have in specific lines of work. But that's the basic part of working in TechU. This assembly is not only necessarily, it's not only listening to each other and have the respect of the people that are already saying, but how to create this common narrative. That is basically the tool that I use the most. I would like to share with you right now.
Thank you, Daniel. And to go back instead to Gabriela, I think for you, or I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, or like perhaps I interpreted like all the other way around. I think for you it's a little bit different because a biennial as such, it's not about eternity at all, right? Or in terms of, or like to put it in relationship a little bit with the context of a museum collection, right? So, and of course it's something that somehow rewrites itself edition after edition, right? So what basically you think, or like you are thinking to propose as a way to rethink a little bit the biennial as an education tool in and of itself, I think it's very interesting, because how can exactly the biennial, or the fact that is something that rewrites itself little by little, like every 2 years, is becoming a tool in itself. So, like to put also a little bit in perspective with what Daniel was saying before, like how do you deal with this idea of rewriting a device itself year after years, and how do you build a narrative with that or behind that?
This is a really good question. This is like somehow a process that I'm thinking, because this is somehow thematic for my PhD altogether. But I think there is the time itself, I think, is the element that we kind of crosses what we are talking here, because of course we expect a biennial to raise itself every 2 years and start from the scratch somehow. And what's happening recently, and it happens in some examples, as for example the Mercosur Biennial, and somehow a part of the history of Liverpool Biennial too, and São Paulo Biennial, and maybe more recently also even Venice Biennial. They're trying to kind of concept in a way that you can do or maintain part of the team, at least in between biennials, that somehow still hold this kind of narrative of the history of the legacy of what's going on before. because this is a huge problem institutionally that you have, because every time you start a new biennial, maybe besides the financial team and a couple of people in the production, you have you erase completely what you have done before. You erase completely your mailing list. You erase completely the idea of the people you connected the last year and everything. And then you have a creator coming, ideas coming, and you start from the scratch as nothing happened before. And this is a gigantic problem that we have historically in the biennials, because they are such like light element. This is the thing, you're thinking about biennials because they want to be quick. This is somehow the idea of the biennial itself. But at the same time, there's an element of community that's being inserted, especially after the educational turn, discursive turn, and all these turns that we have. We have a community element, a connection element of the community, because the biennials are not made only for the art system itself. They are made for the people that are locals to the biennial. They are somehow a process that you kind of create a space to connect all these other environments happening in the art system into a biennial system locally to the people there. So we have all these level layers, there's the global, the local in the same place, and somehow the biennial is that. I feel that when the biennials can maintain part of the team at least, or at least these teams that are responsible for the local narratives from one edition to another, you can see an implementation of possible projects that kind of expand in time and expand the time of the biennial itself. I speak quickly in my video about two projects that happened that I know about. One I was directly connected, and the other one is connected from the Liverpool Biennial, that I wasn't connected, but I can understand the legacy of that. So the Mercosur Biennial 2011, we did a project called the Casa M, which is an M house that expanded. It actually started before the biennial in May and finished in December. So we had like this really long house in which you could explore different connections with the community in very different levels, and was really busy, and we worked a lot that year because of that. But also it expanded completely from that space of the exhibition that lasted just from September to November, which changes completely the way you connect to the community, and also create a much bigger possibility of you connect and establish other spaces of exchange and knowledge throughout the city that maybe are not inside the exhibition or inside the space that is from the biennial itself, which is quite interesting. But this is only possible in the 8th edition of the biennial 2011 because this was going on since the 6th edition that happened in 2007, when Luis Caminita was the creator, and then Marina De Cara in 2009. So you have this kind of legacy. So this is like you need like maybe three or four editions of a biennial to constitute such a possibility or context, that either like the institution itself receives the possibility of renting a house. It was insane. I didn't believe the board accepted that at the time. Renting a house for like all this period, for us to occupy that with the whole archive, and be there. I had the keys. It was insane. They gave me the keys. It was crazy that, it's intense that you think about the possibility of having this space with such lots of people. But here in Liverpool, what I think is really interesting is the project that was conceived by, maybe John even know more about it, but it was one, John van Herswijk was invited to come for the biennial in 2012. And she started to visit Anfield area and talk to the community. And they started this project called Two Up, Two Down. So that it was like a kind of a certain loads of conversations around there. And then at a certain point, the bakery on the corner left the space. They took over the space. I'm not sure the order of this, the narrative of the orders. And then after some time, this creates what is now Home Baked, which is a community land trust. That in 2014, somehow the biennial had to create a process of like a handover to the community of this project, which is quite really beautiful to understand, because this kind of expands in so much in time the exercise or the biennial itself, that the biennial has to kind of, okay, we are letting you go, or we are getting ourselves out of this process somehow now, trying to understand that our participation here somehow is done. And just like last month, there was a musical telling the story of Home Baked that happened here in Liverpool. I was really sorry I couldn't go, but I was really curious about that. So there's lots of things that happen in expansion of time that you cannot control inside the biennial, but the biennial has an element, has the capacity to propose it in a certain different way. I think that maybe other institutions can't. This is the thing, biennial can gamble. You know, the biennial can gamble into the things and just say like, okay, maybe it's gonna happen, maybe it's not gonna happen, let's see what it is. The same thing happened maybe here in 2018 when Mohamed Borussia was invited to come to Liverpool and to work in this area of Granby. This area I mean because I'm neighbor here to the school where he worked. And we were all expecting him to do like a film, maybe telling the story of the strikes here or something like that. And he was really involved into like plants and migration of plants. And then he was involved into the Granby, the guerrilla gardens of the community. And then he decided he wanted to do a garden. And the only place that was available to do was inside the school. So the school accepted it somehow, accepted to open the space. So like loads of health and safety around this, if you can imagine. But at the same time, the garden that Mohamed Borussia did is not open to the public, but the school kids have an hour a week in the garden since then. So maybe it's not like a process that publicly leaves something for the city, but leaves something for the 200 kids that are in the school that are going every week to a garden now, and that has like kind of a whole proposition, a whole coding law. So yes, the biennial is compressed in 2 years, but also is a space that you can create possibilities and exercises of things that maybe you cannot, and then you have to give up after some time of being part of it because they have their own personality, and this is so beautiful as well, I think.
Thanks.
I think
Thanks.
it responds.
Yeah. No, perfect. Thanks, Gabriela. So now I'd like to then go back a little bit to this idea of the toolkit or the manual or the set of instructions. So, and this is a question that I'm also asking myself, but perhaps I'm open to all the panelists and perhaps also other people here that I know a little bit that they are already working in this kind of direction. So why do we need to produce this toolkit? And I think that what could be taken as a common ground between your presentations, Gabriela, Lisa, and Daniel, it's like a sort of lack of historical references, or not just historical, but references to this kind of processes. Which is also what is driving my research around archiving practices and archiving arte utile, for example. So how do we create the toolkit as a common resource in collaboration with those we engage with? And also, this is something that I would like to, like think together with you. How do we negotiate like this kind of power structure that somehow we create while we work towards, like creating the toolkit to engage in the future with a certain kind of constituencies, and how do we rethink and readapt this toolkit? So whoever wants to respond between you, Gabriela, Lisa, and Daniel, please go ahead.
I think for me, it's really interesting to also see the examples, because there's not, like what I was missing is I know how, if you are having an exhibition, to connect somebody who, because that's what a lot of museums or institutions now look, is how to activate the audience. It's very hip. So if there's a clear question or exhibition format, then it's not that difficult to commission an artist to respond to that in some way. But I find it much more difficult as an education department to just ask an artist to collaborate with us without responding to a set framework. So I think for me to have other just references of how, as a museum education department, I could have these conversations I feel like I'm learning on the job. So I'm looking for other examples of programs, and because people are really, I think that's the toolkit also. It's like a framework you are trying to create when the exhibition isn't the right framework for what you're trying to do. So if an actual object at the end isn't the purpose, or an exhibition plan, how can that framework still be produced to give some, because people need framework, people need something to kind of work within. It really also helps inspiration, I feel. If the question is too open, it can also fall flat. So that's, I think, what would be really practical about something like a toolkit, also from the other, being on the other side of the, not being the artist, but working with artists and wanting to be as sensible as possible while working with artists is something that I'm really trying to figure out.
I just really quickly would like to say, thinking about the use of this toolkit, of course there is we need to assume, you already mentioned this, Alessandra, that there is a monopolization of stories and these narratives. And I speak a lot since from the context that I've been living so far here in Mexico City, a city that has there's 69 different languages spoken all the time, but none of them are in the school. No? I believe that this toolkit, for me in my case, or at least in this context, needs to be implemented with different, it's a toolkit made of different toolkits. And one of the basic things that I consider I do with my work is just to ask people just listening, how are you? This huge diversity. It's just how are you? It can be, as Lisa mentioned, it's just really open question, no? That can fall flat, but it's the beginning. And this toolkit needs to be open with no end, open-ended. So for me, it will be, that's something that is really important, just to keep knowing the huge diversity. And also I believe, and even in Amsterdam or Liverpool, it's of course a different reality than in my country, in Mexico, but it has this huge cultural diversity. And this toolkit needs to be addressed with most of the people possible, representation of this huge and immense diversity. And for me, that's important with the notion of dreams. I only know one narrative of dreams, the Eugenia, with the tricky community. There are many, even though we can also create our own. It's a toolkit that through time, implementing the exercises of these notions will be a little bit more robust, and it will change during time. We need to assume that it has to be changing during time, and it's for the future generations. We can conceive it for 7 years to come, or even more. That's some of the ideas I would like to share right now.
Thanks. Gabriela, would you like also to answer this, or perhaps, okay. I don't know if there is already someone that has some question, or perhaps I can proceed. I still have a couple of topics that I'd like to discuss, but you know, like, let's, I just also want to check the temperature of the audience, or like the participants. I don't know if someone has already some questions, or so if nobody is muting the microphone, I'll proceed then with the other couple of questions. No, Andy, please go ahead.
It's maybe just to, say thanks again for all the presentations and for the good discussion that's happening at the moment. I think the bit I just wanted to sort of pick up on that thing you mentioned, Alessandra, and maybe what I was just thinking about there, sort of as Daniel was talking, and Lisa as well, but about this sort of post-scarcity idea of kind of education, that it feels like sort of like knowledge is this thing that gets produced and everyone can have a bit, and obviously it continues to generate itself rather than sort of one person has it and someone else doesn't. And then this sort of turn within kind of artists to be thinking more about the thing that they're producing to be the sort of knowledge, or the kind of thinking about education, but more that it's hand in hand with this sort of dematerialization of the art object that you mentioned, but also that, yeah, it then creates this sort of common good that anyone can have. So we're thinking about this sort of post-scarcity kind of situation. And just maybe, you know, going back to a really direct question on it for like Gabriela or Daniel or Lisa, where it's kind of, how happy would you be, or do you feel any pressure to kind of keep intellectual property over any of those kind of things that you produce within the context of either a school or an art project or a kind of museum? Because I mean, I think that's kind of sometimes where you come up against the like a barrier with that, in the sense that, you know, if I was producing kind of methods and tools within the context of a commission maybe, or kind of for a certain type of museum, they might then want to say, oh, well, we came up with that and we don't want to just see kind of yeah, the museum down the road doing exactly the same thing. So there's a kind of tension, I think, between this idea of kind of creating the tools and then who gets to use them. And I just wondered whether any of you had experienced that or wanted to say something about it.
I haven't yet, but I might. This is like, I've not been at the museum for that long, so I think, but I did my PhD on institutional critique, so I try to be very, like, I know that if Boijmans, which is the biggest museum here in Rotterdam, I know also the position. So not just intellectual property, but I know if Boijmans asks a question, people will be listening, and kind of how you as an artist deal with that. Like if you, because the people that we now work with are all Rotterdam based. So for them, it's also, if I'm working with them very closely, it really is a conversation between the two of us. I do feel the sense of, where does Boijmans begin, and their project, like how much of it is theirs and how much is Boijmans. So I'm trying to be very mindful of, also if I publish something on the website, that I try to really think about how they want to frame it, and I always send it to them so they also know, but I want it to be their projects. They are also working with other people. It really is a collaboration. So the learning part is within those artists, those three artists have really chosen to work with workshops, so with a group of people, some young artists, some local residents. And I don't want them to feel the pressure of having that voice of Boijmans, because it really is their project. So I really want to like make a clear cut of when they start to produce anything. That's also why in the publication, I don't want to show the results of the workshop. If they want to show it after this, we can make that happen, but that will be a separate thing. But the results of this Artist Educator, I really wanted this kind of to be this conversation and reflection of the program between our small team and them and the collaborators and everybody they want to include within that conversation. So I do feel that balance of like, where does the institution have an opinion and where do I need to just let things happen? But for me, it's their artwork. It's not a collection piece afterwards. We'll learn lessons, but it's not that we own that workshop or anything afterwards. So I think that would have to be stipulated in advance with them.
I just want to say that I understand very much what you're saying, because I think there is for me like two challenges around what you're saying. One is about authorship, because kind of falls into this all the time, and because you're in the arts, it falls into authorship, like how you assume into something that is not gonna to be yours, but sometimes because you're starting has to be yours, and because you're going to make a website, I don't know, something. You have to, so there's no maybe physicality of that itself, but someone has to be responsible for the beginning of something, and this is really kind of important, crucial, but is a challenge. And the other thing is about what Daniel just told about the context. You know, like the contexts are completely different from one place to another, and how to be open to a point in which you can receive from these different contexts, and also understand the differences as well. I think this is about two things I understand: authorship and the differences of context.
Thank you, Andy. That's a really really good question. And in my experience, or at least a really concrete example, that this will be an evolving reflection for myself. It's, for instance, the development and the creation of tachographs. That is also a tool meant as a didactic material in order to provide another version of the different subjects that are taught in school. But also there was a huge discussion in the AMI in the beginning when this idea was just delivered, how to create this material and what do we want to share? Because it's not only, let's provide all the different knowledge that you can find in an anthropological research, that this is our cosmology, this is the way we perceive our gods and nature, but rather than what will be important for a specific audience and a specific group that will be kids in elementary school. So that's a really basic question in order to what we want to share, because it's really a refined process and really slow, the decision of how to create this tool specifically and what can trigger in the future. And also working in this process, me as an artist, the one that is as an initiator of the process and the one that makes the drawings, it is really important to conceive that we know that we are using art context also as a way to share this specific project. And it has specific rules. I have the possibility to get some grants, some production budget from the government, from different art institutions to keep doing tachographs or the other projects with the other communities. And it has these basic rules that is the artist that shows the process. And that's a really prolific, huge reflection with the group, because the notion of authorship, who is the author, is not from those communities. We work together in order to create something that will help us eventually. So I like to think that I'm immersed doing tech and working with these groups. And when the assembly, they all go, this is good, I feel a little bit more calm ethically, because there's something with every project I will have to make this, to watch my face in order to understand what is the degree of involvement that I'm doing with the art institution. Every day, the more I'm more professional in this line of work, I realize that the notion of artist begin to be more like the artist, Daniel. So that's quite heavy, of course. It's really, really heavy and quite challenging. But that's something I have to keep in mind. What do we want to share and have all the time possible? That's why long-term processes are really important for me, because there is no rush in creating these, these subversive materials. And it's not my idea at all. I just ask, as I mentioned, how are you? What do we want to share? Because it needs to be shared something. That's for sure. It needs to be shared because there's a lack of many things and a lot of impositions that makes me really angry. And those groups with this diversity, it really provides different points of view that can really help kids or students, and that's it. A really, really good question. Thank you.
I just want to add quickly one thing from Daniel's perspective when he told about like because I'm becoming the artist. I had an experience with a Mexican artist called Sebastian Romo. Maybe you know him. And he was in Brazil and we were working one of these educational projects on the border of Brazil and Argentina. And one of the teachers came to me and said, "Thank you very much for bringing an alive artist to deal with the kids." And I was so impressed about this, because I was just like, what do you mean about this? Because like they could see and someone that is an artist and is alive and thinking creatively. That's what she was telling me. She wouldn't consider maybe the sculpture people, the painters or the musicians of the city the same way, but I was really impressed about this. Of course, it was like a context specifically, but that impressed me so much that somehow this is how I began to research about it, I think.
And I like the relationship that you say that just begins with how are you. I think it also begins with just getting to know each other, because often you have never met the person, and I think the beginning is just really like, do we connect? Is there a shared interest? Is there, and before you talk about planning and timelines and budgets and all that stuff, I think it really starts with like getting to know a person and taking the time for that. So like, I think when I've noticed, because I've never worked for an institution this large, I now notice in Rotterdam, when I start talking and they know I'm Boijmans, I begin as the institution. And then after a while, I become Lisa, and I become a person, and then I think when I've noticed that I've gotten into this, then I'll start to think like, okay, maybe we can collaborate. And I also fully understand why that is. I have no problem with that, but I do feel the responsibility and also the urge to get away from that label as fast as possible, and also just really collaborate with a person and see what we can do together, which is always a nice feeling when that click is starting to happen.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, I saw that Manolo Callahan joined us. So welcome, Manolo, from San Francisco. He's also going to be part of the symposium. So thank you for joining us in such a really early time for you, I guess. I also, while I was, like listening to this almost 1 hour and 15-minute conversation, I also noticed another similarity between the projects you presented or you are involved with, but maybe I'm pushing it too far. So please tell me if it's not correct. I was thinking that somehow the art project or the project, it's already a manual or a toolkit or a set of instruction, right? So we were talking about this morning of this notion of the one-to-one scale, and which basically refers to art that is not representational, rather operational. So yeah, I don't know, what do you think about that? Because this comes also from what Daniel was saying before, like this idea of producing the toolkit of toolkits. But I think it's also, I made this connection also with what Andy was saying about post-scarcity. And I have been thinking about the idea of creating a toolkit. There is this tension, right, to think about subtract art from scarcity, but at the same time compiling the toolkit by accumulation of information, or like in the case of archive, it's like an accumulation, etc. So yeah, I don't know if I'm just pushing this too far, but do you think that the idea of the art project could be already in itself a toolkit?
I think, Alessandra, you are working with the concept of the toolkit a lot. Could you maybe explain how you understand the word toolkit? What a toolkit is for you, or DPE?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about, if I perhaps can mention one of the projects that was already discussed a little bit, which is home baked, which some of you might be already familiar with that, but Gabriela was explaining it really well, which is basically a bakery which started as an art project. So it's a result of like a very long process of engaging with the community that lost a bakery actually in this neighborhood called Anfield in Liverpool. And then they decided to claim the project or claim the process as themselves in order to create a bakery back. So it's actually like a very clear process that is very well documented through the different phases of the project. So I was wondering that rather than creating a toolkit that says, okay, if you want to claim back a building within your community and create a community land trust, you need to apply these tools, while the experience in itself of home baked is already a tool for like going against gentrification, for example. And so rather than creating the toolkit of toolkits, there are projects that are already toolkits, or like, I don't know, this is something that I was thinking while I was, I'm writing notes about what you said. So I don't know but if I'm pushing it too far, please stop me. And I see also John has the raised hand, so please unmute yourself.
Yeah, is it just a really quick one? It's a beautiful conversation. I agree that what are often seen as artworks can themselves be toolkits, but that kind of makes us rethink what art might be, because then we cut across those early conversations of authorship. Quite often, when something becomes an artwork, we start to think in terms of, and understandably so, in terms of permissions and all of those kind of things, instead of those possibilities like home baked in Anfield being resources. And I think that really quickly leads back to something you started off with, which is why decentralized and political economies. Because when we first think of that phrase, it often seems like we're thinking of a literal, physical, centralized political body or governance from which we are at a distance, that we're on the periphery, and how do we change that from the center, which is not a bad thing to think of, and certainly part of the whole idea of decentralizing political economies. But I think Gabriela put it well as well. I think you can also think of decentralizing political economies from a local and day-to-day and tactical level, in terms of centralization actually being the pinnacle of a hierarchy. We're always within pyramidal structures in universities and museums, etc. They're necessary for organizing, but they can also become stumbling blocks. Biennials having a twice yearly flashpoint, which then actually starts to dominate everything as spectacle and loses the impetus of kind of local input, etc. So to kind of square that circle, I think using projects as toolkits in order to rethink those hierarchies to become a much more rhizomatic operation of possible activisms that kind of begin to dissolve those hierarchies is really important. And in order to do that, we need to claim those artworks back as communal possibility, and not the authorial responsibility of individuals.
And I also think like the work that Daniel does, it's so personal. It's also, you came across this because you are you and you have your experiences. And that's, I think, with Sigam Chung worked with, she teaches, but she also works as a non-narrative filmmaker. She describes herself, and she always works in conversation with people. So what she's doing now is in Rotterdam on one specific street, which is getting rapidly much more gentrificated. There's a lot of shopkeepers, and she is working with them and being in conversation with them to capture like street photography, their shop from the outside. And every artist is going to make a different kind of caption of another place on that same street to kind of, through a different perspective, have one street visual in one project. But because she always works within conversation with people, that's how she does it. It's also like the educational part is the workshop. So she brings other artists within, but it's also difficult because only she can do, like, that's who she is. Like, it's not a tool. Like, she's really thinking of how do I make this a workshop, because it comes, like, it is a very bodily experience for her. It's not something that she can teach other people. It really is through this interest in other people, and she feels very protective of it. You can really feel that when she brings other people now within the shops, she really wants to make sure that it's done right and it doesn't change the dynamic too much. And she's really very careful of that relationship. So I think it's also very personal when an artist works. But she is very interested in how do I, because a lot of the students do not work with people. So they are photographers within streets, but are not very good in making connections. And I think after COVID, it was also very like weird almost to have those very personal relationships. So it's also wonderful to see, but it's also difficult for her. So like she's kind of thinking of how to make it like a toolkit for her own projects, and it's working, and it's a really wonderful project, but you can also kind of feel the inner struggle for her bringing in other people within that very personal process for her.
I had a similar experience. I think I work with many different artists. I'm a facilitator for maybe more than 20 something projects with artists in residencies, and I think what I understood from my perspective as a facilitator of artists with the community is that there's a kind of, each artist has their own methodology and their own kind of training for that, because they have their own narrative, as Danielle is saying. They have their own narrative that they want to be reflected in when you're talking to the people and to them, because it's part of the process. I think that in one hand it might be interesting to think about as an artwork as a toolkit, but the true thing is that especially when you work in engagement with people, is that even though you think that you're going that way, you're going to change your way 100 times, so there's not really, you can't really translate it to something that is a model compact. Maybe later you can tell about the story, what happened, but you cannot really determine this. And one project that I worked that had like this kind of big shift was this project I worked with Ana Laura Lopes de la Torre for the Mercosul Biennial 2013. Ana Laura Lopes she didn't want to be part of the biennial at all. She was really convinced through time from Sofia Choncuy, that now she's a director of the Melis in Rotterdam, I think. She was convinced by Sofia to participate because she told her, I promise you that I'm going to take, you can choose what you want to do, whoever you want to work with, how you want to do. She just said, I do whatever you want, just come and do something, please, with us. And she, after like maybe 3 or 4 visits to the city, she accepted it. And then she decided that she wanted to work with the water, the history of the water of the city, and think about borders and maybe remapping it. And then in the second or third interview we did, there was one of the interviewees that she said, yeah, but I'm Mãe de Santo is like a mother saint, which is like I'm from the Candomblé, which is like it's connected like as like an Afro religion in Brazil, and the water is really important for me because this is part of my saint process and everything. So this interview kind of changed completely. She said, oh, okay, so what we are looking actually is the narratives of how the people actually relate to the water. It's not like mapping it or how they pursue like the border itself of the water, but what's their relation, what they tell about it. And she shifted completely the project. And then she interviewed 65 people around the water, trying to understand what's the narratives of the water itself, not the mapping or what changed physically, on that. And yeah, this is quite incredible when you understand that one person there can change the project completely. And because it indicates that, because maybe you're walking around and look, there's a bakery that's going down here, that maybe can do something.
Thanks for another super inspiring round of thoughts. And I'm just gonna read quickly the kind of comment or question from Alice, who is in the metro. So she says that some art projects have a methodology embedded in both their theory and their practice. And in that case, she doesn't think that there is a real separation. So perhaps already what we have been saying, it's both a project and a tool, and therefore a toolkit too, isn't it? So yeah, somehow I think this is also, like, that's a fact, that's true. Like there are some projects that goes already in that direction. That's why I was thinking, I was inviting you to pushing it really far in staying with me in this kind of speculation moment. So I also have another question, but again, if someone would like to jump in, please do it. Otherwise, I'll just go. Okay, so I was also thinking while we were discussing about the different practices and projects that all of you and all of us, I guess, are basically operating as a bridge, let's say, between a sort of traditional way of thinking about art, because we place our practice and, like ourselves in institutions, and all that together with constituencies, with other kind of constituencies and other kind of public and audiences and users that approach art. I think it is interesting to point out that somehow, even though what we do perhaps that does not sound particularly new, it's a way to sort of reposition a structure, perhaps into a community. And I'm thinking, for example, about the method of Teikyo that Daniel has been using for many years, or I'm also was thinking about the fact that he was mentioning that there are 69 languages spoken, but none of them in schools or like part of the official curriculum. So somehow this idea of Teikyo, you are trying to reintroduce it, or not to reintroduce it, but to create also a narrative that can be shared with others that don't belong to this particular tradition, or on baked that was mentioned by Gabriela, or again in the case of Lisa, with respect to the engagement with the other community through Rss Educator. So I was wondering, what do you think about that? So like to think about like this kind of dialogue that through a sort of practice that is traditional, or like coming from, let's say, a traditional point of view, it's able to bridge or to make a bridge with other communities in order to somehow reposition the structure where we are working from. So I don't know if it was a bit confusing, but...
No, thank you. I will try to elaborate with some of the things that are happening right now in the process of working with the AMI. That after 10 years, AMI, the Assembly of Indigenous Migrants, has changed and created in different groups. All of them still are linked, working with each other, but in different locations. And I still think, reflecting about the toolkit, for me, it's really important. Now I'm about to move from Mexico, but I still have many projects and ideas that I would like to keep developing here. So a few years ago, I started to realize that I needed to conform a specific group of collaborators, that not necessarily are the ones from the AMI, because we need, for instance, people that can visualize those different knowledges. Like what I do is to draw these stories. I need someone that can actually be immersed in this process, but this is not like making an illustrator, hire an illustrator. No, you need to be involved in the process and to be participant in the Teikyo sensibility. And no, like I mentioned, no rush, just to ask, being sensible. That kind of thing is, how can you share that? You need to be immersed in the process. So in a way, that's something that, for me, thinking about the different methodologies of artistic projects that can be implemented in these toolkits. It's kind of a workshop, what I do with my students. After 10 years teaching in the university, I have selected a really group of the most sensible students, at least, the ones that can actually draw, but they are quite sensible and really beautiful persons, to have these common gatherings with the people in the AMI and these other groups, and to be just present, and to have these notions and sensibilities of how to be immersed, to listen to each other. And so it's a long-term process that can actually be inspiring for the toolkit, in a way that thinking about different projects, how they provide, as Alice mentioned, different methodologies and different experiences. But the one that I made is, the one that I'm practicing, is this Teikyo. It will be really interesting to how exchange these sensibilities and practices with other, like the bakery project. That's just one idea. Let me complement it with another one. Something that also happened here in Mexico in different communities, when that's something that has also people from the Army has told me that there are specific groups of activists that come from indigenous groups here in Mexico, also from Oaxaca, that are traveling from town to town, trying to see what are their urgencies and try to exchange different methodologies that have worked in specific places. Basically, to solve challenges with the natural disasters, specifically heavy rains and that kind of thing. What has worked in a specific context, maybe to take that specific notion or strategy to the other one. It's like a living toolkit now. I'm thinking about that. But there is this will of keep working and exchanging ideas. No? So that's something that I just kept thinking about, this toolkit, and I don't really know if I have anything to do with your question at all, but that's something that I kept in my mind that I wanted to mention. But
can I ask you a question, Daniel? I was just wondering, if we're talking about toolkits and you've done this for a really long time. I was in the dream workshop for a short time before. I had to leave for an hour. But do you think that this practice of within dreams and collaborating, if you're not present, would you feel, not I'm asking you to do it, but would you feel comfortable writing it as a toolkit for people to kind of, if we in Rotterdam, and I'm really not, it's not official, but just like hypothetically, if we would want to do your workshop in Rotterdam, would you be able to make a toolkit for it? Or is there really something about the relationship between you being at a place for a really long time, like the project was 2 years? Do you think that is necessary? Just wondering, in the toolkit set of mind, if that is even possible for you in that specific example.
Thank you, Lisa. No, I already developed a specific exercises, because the thing with dreams is you need to trigger the notion in the people that something can actually happen. And that depends on each and one of us. Our workshop was really beautiful, but just for 3 hours, just a group of strangers. But yes, so I have developed some exercises that are just like in this notion of, some sort of manual for creative thinking, using dreams as a tool to explore different ways of reality and perceptions. But for instance, there's one exercise that it is find out what are the birds that are already migrating right now in the country or the place that you live. In a dream, try to connect with them. It's just a really concrete instruction, really try to make it quite poetic. But it is something to trigger. Maybe someone will have this curiosity and will start to develop a process. Or something that is like in your home with your family at 3 a.m., just wake up, gather in the kitchen, have a drink of water, and start to talk about your dreams. It's like Gabriela mentioned before started our meeting, how in the beginning with this Guarani group of people, just start to listen to dreams of the kids. And based in that, maybe some decision making will happen. Just to be aware and sensible. This, for me, this toolkit at least will be to create some sort of the awareness and sensibility of the possibility to conceive dreams as a space for social interaction, or to trigger some things and to know more about yourself. The other thing are the workshops. The one that I made lasted 2 years. Also because I work with kids and within this orphanage and that kind of thing that needs to be, and that was the first one that I made. So it was really with a lot of responsibility. But at least what I can do is to write ideas and to share, and someone might conceive them viable to do some things. It depends. It's not toolkit as at least provoke ideas. That's why poetry also is really important, to inspire in a way.
Yeah, I think I find really interesting is that it just kind of, it's a different way of thinking. And at the moment, like if I was also talking with Tikam about working as an artist as educator, and also for students, I think everything is very like a program. Like you have 6 weeks to do this, you have 2 weeks to do this, you have 2 hours to think this way, and then you will do a workshop for an hour, and then you'll do something else. And at the end of the year, just like they're just like fully, there's nothing that really stuck. It's asking a lot of these students to learn in such a structured way. And I feel like I'm like, at the moment, I'm working more in Excels than with things, because it's just, everything is so structured that what we're doing, everything is X amount of time. We do it every month. We do it, like, everything is very structured. So I think it always also reminds me of what the playing string figures of, like, the Donna Haraway. She uses that metaphor a lot in the book of Staying with the Trouble. It's just these different ways of thinking, spending time, allowing your brain, like meditation. You feel like that necessity of just something that isn't as structured as a thought process is really nice. And I think good in ways of learning, because I think it opens up, if you speak more languages, which we clearly all do with English and stuff, if I translate a text, things open up. And I think you use different parts of your brain with language, or like a dream, or poetry, literature, all of those languages kind of open up different parts of your brain and allow for just a little bit more perspective in what you are doing. So it's really a lovely idea.
I think there is one, John, and then Andy.
Yeah, Andy, it won't be long. I just wanted to follow up what you said there, Lisa, about how important it is to realize how much we're kind of teaching and learning in boxes, you know, and kind of modularization, etc. And I know, just as a little illustration of that, Gabriela and actually Alessandra will be able to join me in this. I run a module called Transdisciplinary Practice, which is to get students to work together to do something that's beyond their own capacity to produce. Now, in the UK and European education system, that's already a tall order, because it's asking them to go outside themselves. They start loving and enjoying it. But the bit that really stumps a lot of them is we also say you don't have to have it finished by the end of the module. You can just kind of plan ahead, even 5 years, 10 years to what it might be, but just kind of put something on the table which gives a process that might get there and tell us where you are at the moment. That's so difficult. We work in that industry, so that's kind of falling off a log for us. But it's so surprising, and I'm sure Gabriela, who helped with the assessments, it's so surprising how difficult even postgraduate students find that, because it's getting trained into a complete on the deadline box, and it's kind of yeah. So I think you mentioned something really important there in terms of education that we should bear in mind, and something like Daniel's offering helps to naturally defeat.
I'm going to leave Andy to speak. I just want to say that the first time I heard the word arts industry was when I came to UK. Never heard this before. I was just like, what you're talking about? What arts industry? No, doesn't connect, sorry.
That's new labour for you. They had to monetize anything that they had in the shed, and arts was one of them.
Please, Andy, go ahead.
I was just, I guess I was thinking about certain things while Daniel was saying, and obviously what John's brought in there as well. I'm thinking if there's a way of sort of them joining up a little bit, but also going back to something that I thought came out that was really nice from the workshop with Daniel yesterday, and this kind of realization about trust amongst each other being like a really key part of all this stuff that we're talking about. And it's kind of like, I think, I don't want to abstract too much what we're talking about with education specifically, but this idea of kind of, if artists are going to be thinking about what they're producing as tools for others to use or for others to activate or to kind of contribute, then there's got to be this sort of trust that they will be used in the right way or for the right purposes, or kind of like, and I wonder if, is there another toolkit, or the toolkit, which is about this sort of conditions for use, or kind of an agreement that sort of which is kind of, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's almost covered in that sort of Creative Commons license that you might use kind of for general stuff, but like for artists in particular, or artistic processes where, I mean, I think, yeah, as the object becomes less and less important, then actually the methodologies, even the terminology, the kind of like, oh, well, that person has, you know, works in this certain way, and these are the stages that they do their community engagement, that becomes the practice. And to kind of willingly give that away or share it, you know, is kind of requires, yeah, a degree of trust and a kind of an agreement amongst, I suppose, a kind of body of practitioners or kind of theorists or whatever, that, oh, we're all in this together, so it's fine to be sharing, you know, these as the common thing. But yeah, do people need, you know, well, I suppose, yeah, to put it in on the reverse, would there be a position where you'd be like, oh, well, I'm happy for it to be used apart from this or not for these reasons? And that's kind of where these agreements in spaces come up, isn't it?
Thanks, Andy. I see that there is Alice hands raised, but before I just wanted to mention something related to what you are bringing up, Andy, because, for example, which is related to the idea of trust, but also to this idea that we were discussing of immediate intimacy, right? Especially in the context of, you know, like in this kind of context where we are meeting not in person, but via Zoom. We don't know each other, maybe someone knows somebody else, but like this moment of trust that we put in this kind of exchange create like this idea of immediate intimacy, which is like really present. So, for example, because the centralizing political economies and especially the symposium would like hopefully function as a toolkit, at the beginning we were thinking, okay, we just record all the sessions and we put also the workshop into the website, so it's there for everybody to engage and to share. But actually yesterday, when we meet, John and I, we decided that perhaps we have to, you know, like respect this condition of immediate intimacy, especially during the workshop, like, because we were really discussing like personal, let's say, or like personal things. Of course, it was not about like sort of therapy session, but this engagement and this level of intimacy that is happening in the workshop perhaps is not really the case, you know, like to share with everybody else what happened as a conversation within the workshop. So we decided actually to create a sort of manual or toolkit or like exercise out of the workshop itself. So perhaps we just write a report, and we of course, obviously, we are gonna write some keywords or like some key concepts that emerge. But I think that like we have to acknowledge that a certain kind of trust it's in place, and we don't want to break that trust, even if we are doing something like this, which is clearly like an event or a workshop, etc. So that's, I wanted to respond a little bit and to make the bridge between also the idea of the symposium as actually a way to rethink also how to work in this context. So Alice, I'll give you the word to you.
Yeah, sorry. It's also a way to say bye-bye to everyone, and thanks so much. So following what you just said and what Andy said, and I mean, what everyone more or less said, with trust comes also risk. So one of the, for me, I mean, with my work that now I'm not going to tell you, but because I work in the similar fields as Alessandra and Andy maybe knows, and also Fabiola, but working with other artists, first of all, working with methodology that it's most of the time a personal methodology extended to other artists or art workers, or working with institutions or with private citizens, so with the communities, there is, of course, a level of intimacy that can be built, but especially with manual or instruction that are meant to be left for who is coming after, so for the future, there is always a level of risk that artists are more keen to take, I would say. And it's something that should be protected And I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, I think it's something that should be protected and somehow also encouraged, like in other people, to think a little bit crossing borders and out of our regular way of seeing artworks, or the system itself, or even instruction, the meaning of what does it mean to give instruction to someone to do something. There is always a level of risk that it's not necessarily a problem or a bad things. Can bring the toolkits itself can be just moved to a different step of is somehow a function. And it happens to me, just to close, that we did a project with a small community of inhabitants in a building in Verona some years ago. And the year after, we went back to see what was happening to our project and that we made with them. So it was our project, our artists, but also the community. And they have to cover, and they have transformed our methodology in their methodology. And it's something that for us was unexpected. And actually, we kind of embraced it, and we were happy. And we even pushed them to go further, even if at the end of it, what we'd done at the beginning will probably not be even recognizable. But it's not the meaning itself. It's that they took it and they just transformed it in what was their idea. So for me as artists, it's important to take risk always if I trust someone. And if it's good, okay. If it's not good, doesn't matter. I have to go.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks to everyone. And hugs from a really cold Berlin right now.
Bye. Thank you for joining. Ciao.
Ciao.
All right. So I don't know if there are other thoughts or.
I have just one thing that, of course, one thing that was for me like all the time you're talking about is about time, I think. And you're talking about the time, quality of time on producing the projects, or how to fit these big ideas into the Excel spreadsheet of the 6 weeks of the things that you have to do. How can we convince people that they can think about the beyond the time of the things we have? How can we create time that we can really be together and exchange and really have it? Because I think it's all about time, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
It definitely is. Gemma.
Just wanted to build in what Gabriela said, and of course I want to thank you all because it's been super interesting, super inspiring, and really great. This is the perfect beginning for a panel's discussion. So I just wanted to believe what you say, and I was thinking kind of this is a thought that you have been mentioning, a couple of moments, of course this idea of time, how important it is in the whole idea of social practice, but as well in the idea of the toolkits itself. And I was thinking, and you mentioned as well, have been mentioned before, about the idea of on one side, these kind of oppositions that we are always the tension that exists always between art education, between the object and the process, between, that is always present in this kind of conundrum that we have, built together between art and education. And at the same time, the language, the need of a new language. So I'm wondering if the use of the toolkits itself could provide us this kind of platform of tool to bring in, and kind of challenge these, situation structures that are kind of complicating our daily life while working with education and art and toolkits. And even though if we could introduce even the concept of time into the toolkits, so a kind of a condition of a creation of a toolkit could be, including this consideration of time that should be, I think, considered among all the people, all the members that will build the toolkit together. That's in a kind of a Tekio situation, Daniel. So that's just a question that I want to put on the table.
Who would like to pick up the question, please?
I would just really quickly just mention something that I already talked a little bit, but I think it's really crucial to explore the concept of time in the toolkit of toolkits. And for me, it will be really important just to mention things that I said, to be able to have no rush in order to use this toolkit. You need to be plenty of time. There's no rush. That is something that of course, is really difficult in this frenzy of producing and making, in the academic world, but also in the production of artworks. But that's something that it should be really crucial. And then also something that Andy mentioned, that creates some sort of pact through time, this trust, and this way, trust, I mean, it's not like, it's not easy to make, to forge, to incorporate. It needs time. But also the notion of being, I don't know how to put it on, but more eloquently, but the idea of having no rush, to be plenty of time, to be aware of trying to be immersed in this time and process, having the chance to know others and enjoy the process, which is, so the toolkit, that's something that's something I just quickly mentioned. John?
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of like back that up. I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I think I totally agree with the time thing, and we've got to be really careful at the same time. Sorry about the quirks of English. To think in terms of kind of the generosity of like convivial use value and duration, as opposed to putting delimitations that can be quantified and then start to feed Excel spreadsheets. So it's really important kind of to do that. And what makes the time given as an act of generosity within the Tekio so important is that act of generous reciprocity, I think. And that's so I think Hemmer's right. It's something that needs to be brought in, but quite deliberately as a way to also provide us means and ways of sort of defeating the very sort of fractalization of neoliberal logic, which would break down everything into bite-sized and exchangeable pieces that have equivalent values.
And I think time, because the toolkit, it sounds very result driven, is you're going to do this, but also allowing for that just happy accident to happen, or just time to not productive time, as you said yesterday in the beginning of the workshop. Like the dream, like the goal, very simple goal of meeting each other in one dream together as a group never happened, but that was fine, because then the new goal emerged with like the plans and all that stuff. So I think it's just allowing for some openness, even though it's a toolkit, so there is a structure and there is a goal, but allowing things to happen is within time is also, I think, very important. I think non-productive time is something that we just don't have enough of.
Can I just sort of chuck in another word that, I guess we're also talking, I guess when we talk about tools and toolkits and use, we're often thinking about sort of work, and it does have this sort of productive overtone. Of course, we could also be talking about toys and play and kind of a toy box of different sort of things to be, which is often open-ended and not sort of quite as fixed towards an end goal, isn't it?
I think, as Alessandra, I'm also like proposing somehow in part of my process, maybe trying to understand how to translate my research into maybe a toolkit. And to be fair, right now I'm really obsessed about making a board game. Actually, I'm absolutely obsessed about that, and I don't think I can do anything else right now. But like creating something that it's possible to be playful, because a manual. It's not really, the manuals are there, you know, we can just take the manuals, but how to play this and create something that's playful. And because it's part of what we are creating as well as a collective ideas, because we create archaeologies in our exchanges as well, I think, you know, and this is also like really important. I just want to say that a part of it, definitely HEMA, it's about creating like how to compress and like I call it taxonomy because it's maybe the way to understand it, but how to have this as a like embedded taxonomy in it as well. You know, I'm thinking about both ways too, because I think it's important, because the meaning of things are not the same anymore. We have to rethink about them.
Yeah, but thank you very much, because this reference to time is also something that with Poppy and John we were discussing, like in the context of the symposium, right? So we have been all through these exhausting conferences that last 4 days, where you have like a panel starting at 8, another at 10, and then at 12, and then you have the workshop from 3 to 7, for example. So we really wanted to activate the idea of the symposium, but like with this idea of stretching time. So that's why we decided to have it like in 1 month and 1 month and a half, in order for us, first of all, to actually make it sustainable, like mentally for us, because of course we have been we are super happy to engage in the workshops and in the panel, but then it can be exhausting. But like the idea was also to use the weeks that are between the events, or like the workshops and the day, to actually leave what we said to kind of you know, like how do you say, like stratified on top of each other, right? Or like to give some time to stay there and to transform and to compost maybe and to see what's gonna happen. So that's why some of the sessions are still in development, for example, because we really wanted to build on what we have been saying. So that's actually really interesting, that perhaps there is already this intuition, right, on this idea of stretching time because we need it, put really simply, and somehow in leaving some time between thoughts to other thoughts to emerge, it's also rethinking the way we actually work, or we use this kind of format towards the toolkit, let's say. So I'm happy that also the notion of time and work and taxonomy emerged, because, you know, like I see that there are already like more words and more dots that are, you know, like floating around, and perhaps it would be nice to connect over the next weeks. So thanks for that. All right, so speaking about time, I see that we are perfectly on time to end the session here. So thank you very much to all of you, especially to our panelists, guests, of course, for the super generous, you know, like conversation, and of course to everybody else for being here and sharing your practices and your thoughts and your keywords. And next events are gonna be the 5th of November, morning and afternoon workshop and panels, and keep an eye on the program of the website if you are not registered yet, if you think that you want to participate and take part on other conversation, etc. Just please register, otherwise we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yes,
Thank you
bye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.